transportation options. And ideally, those options should be based on the express needs of the people who are being served, particularly for people who are traditionally underserved. Today's discussion will focus on holistic equity, both in planning and engineering contexts, looking at guiding principles, ways to measure holistic equity, and key takeaways that we've learned from our work on this in this area. Just a bit of housekeeping. There's going to be 3 presentations, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end. If you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to type it into the chat at any time. And during the Q&A period, you can also raise your hand to ask your question aloud or type your question into the chat window. I'll be moderating that Q&A session at the end. So next slide, please. I'd like to introduce our speakers. Caleb Winter is a senior transportation planner at Oregon Metro, the metropolitan planning organization for the greater Portland, Oregon region. He's been working in transportation demand management since 1996 and has been working in transportation system management and operations since 2014. His work includes partnering with community-based organizations to increase transportation options, also convening transportation system engineers to deploy connected vehicle travel information and next generation transit signal priority. He leads the region's 10-year implementation strategy that brings together regional policy to advance racial equity, improve travel time reliability, reduce climate changing emissions, and operate safely through collaboration and new technology. His co-presenter today will be Chris Gergich, an associate traffic engineer at Fair and Piers. He has just over 15 years of experience in traffic operations and transportation design with a focus on ITS, that's intelligent transportation systems, and traffic engineering. In his spare time throughout the pandemic, he's been expanding his sewing skills to go beyond just bow ties. He's learned to cross stitch and embroider, and he's been out hiking as much as possible in the state and national forests and parks. Recently, he made it to the edge of the Mount St. Helens crater. I'll ask you about that later, Chris. That sounds exciting. When sitting at home, you'll likely find him rewatching old episodes of Golden Girls or King of the Hill. Brianna Calhoun is a senior transportation planner at Fair and Piers in the Portland office. She has experience on transportation projects throughout Oregon and Washington, particularly on transportation system plans, safety analysis, multimodal planning, and transit planning. She's worked with numerous big data sources to analyze travel patterns and pass through traffic at the regional and local levels. And she's also worked with both large and small communities to develop transportation goals and policies that meet their residents' needs and set a direction for the future. And our final presenter will be Aaron Goose. He's the Pacific Northwest Transit Planning Lead and is a principal in the Seattle office of Fair and Piers. He's helped agencies throughout the Northwest advance their approach to equity-based transit planning. So now I'd like to hand it off to Caleb and Chris to discuss their work on the Oregon Metro TSMO project.
Great, thanks for that introduction, and thanks for inviting me to this innovation seminar. Really appreciate working with Fair and Piers. Brianna also helped with the TSMO strategy, which we'll talk about. So I'm Caleb Winter. I use he, him pronouns, and everything was in that introduction, so I will only say that our transportation demand management program, we refer to it also as regional travel options. So in case I say RTO or regional travel options, that's what that is. Chris, why don't we pause? Did you want to say anything in an intro?
Sarah gave a great introduction. Thank you for that, Sarah.
Yeah, I'm at the edge of Mount St. Helens with you here mentally. Great. Well, okay, well, next slide, thanks. So TSMO, Transportation System Management and Operations, it is all of us being a better steward of the transportation system, doing more with constrained budgets by managing and operating more efficiently as our first priority. And we practice TSMO when we take a holistic systems approach, develop a broad set of strategies, and strive to innovate cost-effective solutions. TSMO is not believing we can build our way out of congestion. Doesn't work. In the Portland, Oregon region, this aligns with our regional transportation plan goals for reliability and efficiency. Next slide, please. So starting in 2010, that's when Metro developed our region's first TSMO strategy, and I was following the regional policies at that time. But in between then and now, in 2016, Metro adopted an agency-wide policy, the strategic plan to advance racial equity, diversity, and inclusion, which led to the community-focused work in developing the next update of the Regional Transportation Plan in 2018. So that generated nearly a dozen goals in that planning process, and the ones that were prioritized by community are there in gold. And so equitable transportation is now a core focus and is supported in the decision-making for how projects are evaluated for funding. And TSMO fits in as one strategy in that long-range regional transportation plan. Next slide, please. All right. So let's see. So this map is showing equity focus areas, and these were analyzed in the update of the regional transportation plan. The orange lines are high crash corridors or high crash arterials, and then intersections that are also evaluated as severe crash, either death or severe injuries. So we had this as a tool, as a geographic picture of equity. The shades of blue that make up the equity focus areas, and those include higher than average residents who are people of color, people with limited English proficiency, and people with lower incomes. So this was a starting place to prioritize funding and initiate discussions for projects that serve equity by the residents, because that's where the demographics come from. So what I'm getting at is the policy changed, and for us to follow that RTP update with this TSMO strategy update, we needed to follow this community prioritized direction. Next slide, please. After 10 years of TSMO progress, we were reframing how we build equity into our strategy. 10 years back, our vision statement included equity, but other than a few suggested projects, equity was not carried throughout the goals and proposed actions. Beginning our planning this year, we incorporated a broader, more diverse set of voices on our stakeholder advisory committee and in stakeholder surveys and workshops. Also, from the beginning, our first task was to establish an equity focus, and we did that in partnership with Fair and Peers. We look back at the TSMO goals from 2010. They were 4 goals: safety, reliability, traveler information, and quality of life. So these are still important today, but equity planning acknowledges how far we are from sharing the same quality of life as disproportionate impacts persist and we directly or inadvertently recreate those systems. And the national statistics underscore why this equity is important. Households in the lower income bracket spend twice as much of their income on transportation than households in the top income bracket each year. Nearly a quarter of African American households live without a car, are multiple times more likely to rely on transit, and are impacted significantly more when comparing fatality rates for pedestrians. The 10-year planning horizon of the strategy gives us a chance to set off on a path to reverse disproportionate results. A very simplified way to reframe is taking a planning need like Interstate 5 is congested and instead recognizing people of color are disproportionately impacted by congestion on I-5. So with that frame, we'll work with stakeholders on a TSMO approach that works for everyone. So Chris, do you want to describe this one, or I could?
I
think I was.
Yeah, go ahead with it. Yeah,
okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. So we're taking you into 2016 with that strategic plan to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion, the Metro policy, where we're leading by race, saying by addressing the barriers experienced by people of color, we will effectively also identify solutions and remove barriers to other disadvantaged groups. So the equity tree there becomes our assessment tool. It helped us put a racial equity focus into TSMO conversations as we drafted the strategy. And we'll do a brief tour through it. Michael, if you could set up that closer look into the equity tree, and we'll share a link at the end. So equity, like trees, build from the roots up. Our roots were asking for context, choices, and voices involved in TSMO decision-making. Context is identifying the disparities and understanding their impact. Choices are understanding what choices are available or not available to the user and operators of the system. And then voices ask who's being heard and who has a say in the TSMO solutions that we deploy. This better prepared us to redefine the problem to who, what, where before taking steps towards a solution. And then I think if you skip to the middle of that, it'll go to the middle section. And the middle section of the tree describes, well, it's questions around inclusivity in TISMO for professionals, both TISMO agency leaders and the workforce, and are they representing the diversity and values of the region? Also questions about data. Do we need the data to understand or measure equity? If there's a gap, will the TISMO solution help collect that data? And then we'll send the link later. I don't see it scrolling up, but I know Michael's working on it. So once we define the steps towards a solution, we're better prepared for the implementation step. That's at the top of the tree, where we evaluate and are accountable to the results. So does the solution create, reinforce, or remove barriers to travel for Black, Indigenous, and people of color and people with low incomes? To be accountable, we need to ask, did the outcomes help or have unintended consequences despite our best efforts? And what will we do to recover from that? So we've made it all the way through the tree. We've asked all these questions. Yeah, you're seeing them scroll by. But that, you know, if we get to the top there, what, you know, and we still haven't made an impact, a positive impact, then, you know, how will we recover? So I think this is when I turn it over to Chris. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Okay.
Caleb, thanks. And then we're seeing the rest of the tree scroll by there. Click the video. It's just a little lagged, but I'm going to go ahead onto the next slide whenever you're ready, Michael. So thanks. And then the question then really becomes, how did the equity tool shape the development of this TISMO strategy? So our strategy started with a vision statement and then moved into goals and objectives for those goals to make this an actionable strategy, measurable outcomes, and how we can track our progress towards achieving our goals. The strategy includes the performance metrics and targets, as well as an action plan. So starting at the very beginning of the vision statement, which is shown at the bottom of the slide here, we held stakeholder workshops to craft a vision, and we used the equity tree to focus that conversation on both what we wanted to achieve and who was most affected by the types of problems TISMO can help us solve. So as you can see here, the final vision statement starts with a traditional outcome found in a TISMO strategy, things like reliability, agility, and connectedness, but then goes on to very explicitly call out one of TISMO's key goals to eliminate disparities experienced by Black, Indigenous, and people of color and people with lower incomes. Next slide, please. All right, moving into the 6 TISMO goals that were created, again, with the feedback from our diverse stakeholder advisory committee and our project management team. Here you can see those 6 goals and how they incorporate the regional policy outcomes that Caleb went over. But some of these goals reflect more traditional TISMO values of safety, collaboration, and reliability. But in particular, the goal Eliminate Disparities focuses on equitable TISMO strategies and actions, calls out specifically that we want to use TISMO to further transportation equity in the region. The group didn't stop there. Equity is woven into the objectives and thinking for all 6 goals. For example, in the goal Prepare for Change, we wanted to call out the need for agility within the system. While we've all felt the effects of the last 2 years, the groups wanted this TISMO strategy not only to include growth and disruptions from changing technology, but also understanding civil unrest and furthering social justice. Under connected and reliable travel choices, we specify that all people need reliable connections to goods, services, and destinations. And then for the goal, Keeping Everyone Free from Harm, we really wanted to make sure that we incorporated the traditional Vision Zero practices, but we're expanding our understanding of safety to include the harm that comes from experiences that Metro residents have shared traveling at night, not feeling comfortable riding transit or waiting for a bus, or hearing racist or sexist remarks while riding. We are asking the region's planners, engineers, and operators, what are the specific ways that we can manage the transportation system to keep everyone free from harm? Not just bodily harm, but ensuring a sense of safety and comfort while traveling. On the next slide, I'll dig into the Eliminate Disparities goal a little deeper, focusing on some of the objectives we developed for that goal. The first objective still focuses on those key TISMO strategies to provide traveler information. But rather than thinking about simply what information and where it is shared, when it is communicated, etc., and how the focus has shifted to who is being reached and how TISMO can remove the barriers to accessing that information. Does someone need a smartphone or a bank account to access information or a specific travel mode? Should information be provided in multiple languages or in a new and different location to reach the communities that are not currently being reached? To eliminate disparities, we need to identify them. So the other objectives in this goal on how we can first identify past and existing disparities and how the transportation system has been planned and is experienced. And then how can TISMO strategies help correct those disparities so that all people can comfortably and easily travel in the region. On the next slide, we'll go through some of the performance metrics, just an example. These measure the effect that our TISMO strategy and actions are having on the region, allowing us to track our progress and then show the growth through the life of the plan. We, with much discussion and feedback, we came to this list of 7 overarching performance metrics. The performance measures are broad measures for the transportation system. We kept the list focused to make it achievable for Metro, as well as easily tracked. Each measure is further described with key performance indicators and exploratory metrics. Key indicators are those that Metro currently has the ability to track and report, while the exploratory metrics are ones that we would like to advance, but may need further research, new data sources, or policies around reporting. The goal would be to track these metrics as Metro is able and as they develop a process to report them. So I want to go over a quick example on the next slide. So you see here in the top right, we noted which of the 6 goals this metrics supports. Free from harm, eliminate disparities, and reliable travel choices. Here, the key performance indicator is a fairly standard one, the total crashes normalized by vehicle miles traveled per capita. But thinking through the equity tree, we asked who is most affected and what data is needed to understand that question. You'll see this resulted in calling out specifically crash demographics and risk, as well as average miles biked or walked. At this time, Metro has the ability to look at the geography where those crashes happen. This indicates that there are a disproportionate number of crashes occurring in the equity focus areas. However, we also know that those living in the equity focus areas often have longer commutes, walk further to transit, and have a lack of adequate pedestrian and bicycle facilities. For the exploratory metric, we specify crash demographics to determine who is being involved in the crashes. There were many discussions about how this data could be collected and who would be collecting it. This led us to creating an action around researching data sources and developing the policies for processing that information. Similarly, we developed an action to measure and understand crash risk for the equity focus areas and to measure average miles walked and biked to better understand the true rates of pedestrian and bicycle related collisions normalized by active transportation modes instead of vehicle modes. This is just one example, but we used an equity lens to think about all 7 of our performance metrics and worked with local technical groups and the management team to think through how to weave a measure of transportation equity throughout the entire strategy. Our current step is creating actions, and we actually just finished that up. And here is a quick peek of what we've got right now up on the site. So next slide, please. Here again, you see the equity tree. And if you remember, the tree levels had the actions, strategies, and plans. So a series of actions were developed for each of these objectives, and we found that this resulted in way too many separate actions to track and account for, and there was a lot of redundancy. The team worked to group those actions into similar themes, and it started to become very clear that those actions could be sorted into packages. Unintentionally, and I do wish that I could claim some intention for it, those packages really mirrored the equity tree. There are several actions that fall under the planning umbrella, and to get a better understanding of the who, what, and where of the question. Additionally, we have several actions that develop infrastructure and capabilities through a series of related steps to develop solutions. And then lastly, we developed a number of actions that evaluate our progress and hold the region accountable by creating an opportunity to listen to the communities impacted. Let's go over some of the examples. Next slide, please. Goodness. All right. Under Under planning, we identified a need to develop a regional strategy and a policy around mobility on demand, or MOD. This will start by developing a working group that brings in voices from agencies, private partners, and community-based organizations. Additionally, the action includes things like establishing benchmarks for the equity focus areas and developing methods for communicating these options to all travelers and the development of a unified payment system that includes MOD services and transit. As an example of our concepts, capabilities, and infrastructure actions, we considered how to better deploy regional traveler information systems in an equitable way, starting with BIPOC, low-income, and limited English proficiency communities. One of the specific outcomes this action identifies is to evaluate a method for deploying traveler information in a way that does not require personal smart technology, such as screens in public buildings and major destinations or regional centers. And then, as an example of our listening and accountability actions, the group identified the need to create community listening programs. This was rooted in what we heard very early in our stakeholder engagement. A lot of us doing the work don't share the same life experiences as those using the system. The idea here was to create a pilot program that gives the community more access to those that make the decisions in the system, lets them tell us what they experience, and compensate them for it. The idea that came out of this discussion included creating a lunch and learn style program where community members can meet with the engineers and planners in their offices and share their experiences and stories. We're really excited to be finishing up this plan. There's a public comment draft that's currently on the Oregon Metro site, and I really appreciate your all interest in it, and yeah, look forward to hearing some feedback. Caleb?
Thanks, Chris. Oh, I heard an echo. It should go away. So this is just some resources that have helped me along the way, not necessarily on equity, but they're good for an understanding of TSMO. And I think they're adjusting and incorporating equity. I noticed the National Operations Center of Excellence has among their award categories an award for Best Equity Project. But they have a whole glossary of what goes into our jargon and our kind of technology world. And then U.S. Department of Transportation has been really helpful with offering seminars, workshops, looking at capabilities across TSMO, and really gathering regional partners together, operators who might not see eye to eye, hopefully do after some of these experiences. And then the Intelligent Transportation Systems Joint Program Office, or JPO, is a combination of the FTA and FHWA and other federal agencies working on innovations. And they really have done interesting projects to expand access. They're working on the mobility on demand projects, incorporating demand responsive transit, and also things like indoor navigation that are really fascinating that help people with disabilities. So, and then lastly is the research angle with Transportation Research Board. We have a regional TSMO committee, ACP 10, and anybody can become a friend and get emails from that. And I suspect at the annual meeting in January, we'll have a chance to discuss planning equity into regional TSMO. So that's, I think, it for our presentation. Really thanks everyone for attending and giving us a chance to share. We're going on to next speakers, and then I see one question in the chat, but we can wait.
Okay. Thank you, Caleb and Chris. I believe Brianna is going to be presenting the next set of slides here.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, again, my name is Brianna Calhoun. I'm based out of our Portland office of Fair & Pierce, and I am going to take this from kind of that regional planning discussion down to an example of thinking about equity on a little smaller corridor level, and discuss a project that we worked on with TriMet, looking at the Southwest Corridor light rail lines that they have been planning, and looking at equity when planning out the station areas for that line. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of background on the project. There are 13 planned stations for about a 13-mile light rail line that goes from the southern end of Portland down into the suburbs of Tigard and Tualatin. And the project was looking at this part of this larger planning effort was looking at each of those new stations and thinking about each of them as a mobility hub. And that's something that's kind of a term that's thrown around a lot, but thinking about how you can bring different travelers in different travel modes all to one particular location so that they can transfer between modes easily. And we didn't want to think of each station area as exactly the same, just a plug and play, let's throw in all of these different modes in one location, because they all had very different needs, different land uses, different people living around them. And so we really wanted to make sure we were tailoring those to the people that would be using each station area. And so kind of to think about this, we looked at both the public infrastructure and amenity side. So things like where people were transferring from the bus to the new light rail, park and rides, things like bike parking and sidewalk and bike lanes in the area. But then also looking at the potential for private or potentially public-private providers for new mobility options, such as bike share, electric bike and scooter share, different microtransit options such as on-demand or circulator shuttles, and also thinking about car share and ride hailing. And how do you fit all of that into one space and what will get priority in different areas? So next slide, please. So here's a little map of kind of the area. And as you can see, yeah, it stretches across a large portion of the Washington County. And first piece of this was looking at kind of within about a half-mile walkshed of each of these station areas. What kind of land use are we looking at and key destinations, jobs, terrain, because that certainly makes a difference in how people are going to travel, as well as then all of the different demographics that we could pull out to try to understand who is living in the area, you know, what station are they closest to, and how might they be using that station or trying to access that station. So we looked at a lot of different information for each of these and pulled out kind of different groups of people that might be moving into each area and who might be using these potential new light rail stations. Next slide, please. And so looking at all of these, you can look at them all separately, and then as you start to overlay all of this different information for each area, you can start to see potential trip patterns. For example, along the line, a lot of the employment is at the north and south ends. So you have a large hospital at the north and a lot of industrial and retail use at the south end. And a lot of the homes are in the center of the line. So you're going to get some interesting commute patterns in and out of the area. But then really thinking about barriers to mobility and what barriers are people facing. The multiple highways in the area, the interstate, are going to be a barrier for people, as well as there's a lot of terrain and topographical constraints in certain areas. And so thinking about how people are going to be moving around, and then specifically not just by total population, but really tailoring these mobility solutions to each group, thinking about just physical ability, financial ability, and how we can equitably serve everyone and provide as much access as we can for people trying to transfer to transit or to other modes. And so this first part was kind of looking at all of the census data that we had available. And then we took that and then overlaid psychographic data. So this is purchased information that often is used in marketing. So it has a lot of information from like purchasing habits, and we kind of pulled out the area a little bit so we could look at more of a 1 mile stretch around each station area, because there's a lot of people that are coming from farther away or using modes like ride hailing or car share that they might be able to travel a little bit farther. And then the interesting thing about the psychographic data is that it kind of groups people into these different characteristics and tells you a lot about their spending habits and if they're comfortable with technology use. And it kind of takes that census data that it's individual points and pulls that all together so you can understand that this is a if you'll go to actually to the next map, we have some that are aggregated across the area. So you have like low-income seniors that tend to be on a fixed income, some homeowners and renters, and less likely to have cell phones. So you can start to kind of take that understanding of how they might be using the system and layer that on top of the census data to just get a better understanding of what mobility solutions might be better for different areas. And it gave us some really great insights. It was really interesting to look at this and say, for example, the map on the right is the very low income bracket. So anyone under 20,000, this is a household income. And how that might influence what sort of travel patterns they might have. And so if you go to the next slide here, all of this kind of was put together with TriMet staff, with looking at also the right-of-way constraints and flexible spaces and what's available both on TriMet's right-of-way and the agency right-of-way nearby. And we came to this big matrix of recommendations for what potential elements should be included for each of the station areas, and also a degree of kind of a high market to low market. So either a strong recommendation that, we think that this would be a really good fit here. The lighter green is kind of like, yes, there's still a strong market, but maybe you partner with another agency or might, talk to the private provider and find some ways to work together. And then also we had notes about whether this might be something to site on the actual station area, or maybe it could be sited nearby. A good example was a lot of the central corridor is along a retail corridor. And so, for example, there were often grocery stores right next to the station. So maybe there's EV charging, electric vehicle charging located in the grocery store parking lot that they might be able to partner with that's then right across the street from the station. So how can we think of those partnerships too? And then if you'll go to the last slide here, it zooms in just a little bit for you. So yeah, kind of just thinking about the market for these services, who we're serving and how we can best serve them. And then also thinking about how to be flexible, because as we all know, the market changes quickly. New services come in, new providers come in, new technologies come online. And so how do you plan something that's so far into the future and make it resilient to all of those changes? So thinking about flexible zones, like having a curb space that currently could serve paratransit drop-off and pickup, but could also take ride-hailing drop-offs and pickups too. Or maybe as you're planning the station area, you run the electrical that would be available for electric vehicle and electric bike parking, but don't have that infrastructure in place yet, but it's set up for when that's needed. And so really thinking about that flexibility for future planning. And so, yeah, we came up with this big suitability matrix, and I'm happy to kind of dig into different pieces and some of our decisions around those in the questions. But just really thinking about not that one size fits all planning for each of these station areas, but really tailoring it to the people who would be using the space and trying to give them the best access and the most access that we could. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brianna. I think Aaron is going to be our next and last speaker. Take it away, Aaron.
All right, and I think you can see my screen now. All right.
Yes.
Great, appreciate it. Again, my name is Aaron Goose with Fair & Peers, and I just want to talk briefly about some work that we did for King County Metro as part of the mobility framework, and really just talk through some of the details related to the technical approach to help define equity and access. And just some context, the mobility framework was really community-led through community-based organizations and other stakeholders, and coordinated with King County Metro really to help refocus Metro's efforts on how to advance equity, particularly within the context of this constantly shifting transportation landscape that we find ourselves in. So a lot of credit also to King County Metro for taking this initial work and really advancing it into their service guidelines and strategic planning and the long range plan. So I'll talk a little bit more just about kind of the technical approach as we supported those particular efforts. So first off, what is travel access? How do we define that? And at its core, again, access is really what can you reach and when and how can you reach it? We think about it from a multimodal perspective: transit, biking, walking, driving, etc. And in this particular case, it was really focused around transit access. And so looking at specific origins across the entire King County metro area and understanding how far you can reach via transit within given travel times and travel periods, and what can you reach when you get there. And this is just one snapshot, kind of comparing two particular locations in the Puget Sound area, downtown Seattle and over near Redmond, and showing differences in terms of how many people you can reach from a given location. So when we help support kind of defining the term equity and access as part of it, the first question really was who needs access? And this is very related to what Brianna and Caleb and Chris also shared of just helping to define using that census data for who needs access. And for this particular effort, it was defined as priority populations and looking at low and no income households, persons with disabilities, immigrants and refugees, limited English speaking communities, and Black, Indigenous, and people of color. The second question to answer focused around access to what? Historically, just given data availability, we usually focus on jobs, households and jobs and those connections. But this particular effort looked at incorporating additional data sets to understand access to additional services such as school, medical, social activities. And so really using data, using emerging data to help expand the answer to that question gives you a more complete and comprehensive picture to how access really helps advance equity-based outcomes. Access to when on transit was also a key question. Again, historical transit planning really focuses on the peak commute periods, particularly just because of limited data. And so this analysis really looked to understand those differences between traveling in the morning, during the midday, evening, weekends, in particular because what we found is different travel demand at times of day for different populations, and really understanding those differences and the ability to measure them was important. And then finally, where and how can we improve access? Once we've identified some of those gaps for who needs access and when and what and to what, we look at population density, zero car households, and other network options really to help improve that access. And so that took the form of this access composite scoring, which kind of layered together those demographic variables with that transit access metric and sought to identify those priority areas where there's a higher percentage of priority populations and areas that had a much larger significant reduction in the access to jobs and services during the midday period. So looking outside of the traditional AM and PM peak periods. So how to address those particular gaps? That's again where we provided some additional and emerging methodology to more comprehensively analyze the differences in access through different strategies and being able to leverage that at thousands upon thousands of different origin and destinations. So we looked at analyzing increasing the frequency during non-peak period times, investing in speed and reliability infrastructure, particularly in areas with higher proportions of priority populations, looking at non-motorized access to improve connections to the fixed route transit system, first and last mile mobility solutions through innovative on-demand services, looking at the role that passenger amenities and improvement in real-time signage, shelters, et cetera, could have on the experience. And then finally, the role that land use change and increase in density can have to address these particular gaps. And so I'll just walk through two examples for how we analyzed the role of these strategies to address those gaps. One was looking again at how to improve frequency, particularly in the midday and the evening time period on routes that serve areas with higher proportions of priority populations. And we found a substantial increase, just looking at job access for one metric, of up to 25% increase in the average number of jobs that any individual could reach within 30 to 60 minutes. And that translated into a forecast of up to a 3% increase in daily ridership across the system. And again, this analysis is, and what we tried to advance was the ability to turn on and off multiple routes and test different time periods across a wide geography. And these types of analyses and tools weren't available 5 to 10 years ago, just given data availability. So this allows us to provide a deeper dive and a closer look at the role that these different services can provide on advancing equity outcomes. The second strategy we also tested was looking at speed and reliability investments. So again, really focused on routes that serve areas with higher proportions of priority populations, and the role that speed and reliability, such as queue jumps, bus-only lanes, transit signal priority, could have on increasing access and ultimately ridership. And while the numbers show, slightly reduced as compared to those frequency improvements, it's really important to understand the role that reliability has on the travel experience. And that's something that's a little more difficult to capture just in this average kind of increase in job access. So I recognize some of the limitations of using travel access as part of equity-based outcomes as you interpret the differences of the roles that these strategies have in advancing that. So just to, again, recap kind of how this was applied with the mobility framework, but really is something that can apply across all forms of transportation planning. And so it's looking at these particular questions and looking at the data and the methodology and processes that you have to analyze that data. So focused on, again, who needs access, access to what, if you're looking at transit in particular, access when, and then really focused in using those technical tools to understand the cost and benefit for improving where and how that access can be expanded for those particular populations. So with that, I'll wrap up, and I think we can open up to questions.
Great, thank you so much, Aaron. We have one question in the chat so far. Again, please feel free to type any questions that arise in the chat, and we'll get to them. But I would like to first open this up with just a broad question here about how we look at equity. So in planning and public works, we often tend to think about equity in specific contexts. So things like community engagement, transit planning, Title VI compliance. But when it comes to more traditionally technical areas like TSMO, why does equity matter?
Caleb, do you want to jump in first?
Yeah, I think it's been interesting since, like I said, we had equity in our original TSMO strategy. So we had been thinking about it in 2010, and then I didn't mention this, but in 2019 we used that map we showed, the equity focus areas, to kind of situate our projects. And so a lot of our partners wanted to upgrade signal controllers to get to the latest technology for ITS, and we applied that map as sort of investments in equity focus areas, as opposed to where they might not create the best investment in terms of where people are needing better transit reliability, which was just mentioned. So we kind of we got so far, but we in presenting things, like was asked at our planning directors meeting, transportation policy advisories committee, by our community rep. Like I had said a bunch of metrics about how bad congestion was getting in our region, and she asked, whose congestion? Pointing out, like, if we're spending resources on projects and operations and maintenance within an existing system, and it's got a historical pattern that is inequitable, we have to ask that question. So that's where we were reframing and taking a deeper look with this strategy. We want transit to run reliability. Let's add this transit signal priority that was mentioned. Let's look at bus on shoulder. These are things, when we start asking who's congestion, we start becoming more innovative, maybe in the approaches. So I think that's some of why, just describing our background, getting into this TISMO update. Chris, do you have?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to add to that a little bit. I mean, I think you're making a lot of the same points that I'm going to make, but there's probably just a few things to add. I mean, first of all, why is equity important? I think we can just look at ourselves as transportation professionals and know that we can be better stewards. We can do better. We can identify that not everybody has the experience that we have on the system and how they access the system. So I think in all aspects of what we do, equity is important. And I know just through our work my work with ITS Washington, for example, I get a lot of questions about like, well, how does ITS and equity, how does that really overlap? And I think we heard it from all the presentations, and Caleb just touched on it as well. We need to know, first of all, where this, how to measure these equity performance metrics. And I think that we're getting more of those tools come out. I think we've seen quite a few GIS tools in the last couple presentations from Aaron and Brianna, but that still isn't really getting at, that's just where people live, not necessarily where they're traveling. So we want to make sure that when we're doing these investments, it's not just in an area with low income or BIPOC communities, because we also know that we've built a lot of highways through those areas and we don't necessarily want to increase capacity. So being able to understand how that is being affected, what effect that's having on those communities is also a big point. But then where those technologies are going and how that impacts those communities from a positive or a negative standpoint is also really important to understand just how the system works.
Great, thank you. Aaron, Brianna, anything to add to that? Okay. One more general question from me, and then we'll be diving into some of the questions that people are sharing in the chat. Thank you so much for identifying those questions. And this kind of gets up to your point, Chris, just now about what is it that we know around equity. All of these projects are based in pretty data-focused analysis, either in the TISMO case, identifying what will be analyzed, or in the examples that Brianna and Aaron shared, looking at the available data. In some cases, there's new or innovative data sources or analysis methods used to evaluate equity. So what are some aspects of equity that we're currently having a hard time measuring with existing data sources? And how would you recommend working around those gaps?
Well, I think one of the examples that I talked about in the presentation is safety data, right? We know that there's crashes happening inside those equity focus areas. And I think a lot of the folks on the call right now are living in regions that have that data, available through their agencies. But then again, we're not really measuring what the risk is, or even where those, that's just where those communities live, not necessarily where they're moving to or where they're traveling from, how that, extends beyond just those boundaries and what effects that have. So we're looking at even, some origin destination information and how that impacts. And then what mode they're talking about. We talked a little bit, I think Caleb talked about it, 25% of BIPOC communities rely on transit. So when you're choosing an ITS project, are you looking at TSP or are you looking at an adaptive signal system, right? So something that's just going to improve vehicles. It may improve both vehicles and transit, but if you're really trying to focus on that 25% of the BIPOC community that depends on transit, do you choose then to move forward with a next generation TSP project over just a vehicle improvement?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Darren. Oh, okay, real quick. That the challenge of crash demographics, we learned quickly is that it's on a crash site. If there's a form and the incident responders filling it out, they can't make a call as to recording demographics on race, income, anything. So having how do we adapt is going to be a big question, and we have a whole safety strategy as well in the region, and so there's a lot of partnership that we'll have to build up to think about that. The origin destination, new data that's crowdsourced that's might be a possibility. My colleague Elliot Rose looked into replica data and didn't find it to be at its state a few years ago. Good for all the equity and transportation needs we had. We'll look at streetlight data. We'll look at whatever else might support. And we do have something in the TISMO strategy about how to apply that origin destination data to our projects and decisions. But also liked the connectivity index as one of our projects. Count for facilities, modes, travel time, and you think about adding reliability is key to TISMO. How far can you get reliably from one geography to another, but also listening and hearing what barriers do people have, like kind of what Aaron's describing, when are those barriers, all those things shift. And we thought a lot about this through the TISMO strategies. And it also comes from that regional travel options program, and listening and hearing, like, people aren't traveling in some cases because of the barriers they face. We know that, they're not willing to take their kids to the zoo on the Max Light Rail because their kids will hear something racist and they don't want that for their kids' future. Or, so we need to also put put our listening for barriers into those geographies.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that, and that's kind of similar to the question I think Kim raised in the chat, just about limitations, I guess, blind spots to the data. One, typically the data we have available is already biased, just kind of at the scale that it, for that availability, and it's the really it's those smaller points that are more difficult to standardize across a region or across a city that are as important but are harder to measure. And so it's, when we interpret kind of the access metrics and what you can get to, certainly recognizing that jobs is a proxy, and it's also in it can be an unreliable proxy for that opportunity that's required, because a lot of other things aren't necessarily there isn't a direct relationship between the number of jobs and the importance of that medical service or the after-school program or some of these other elements that just don't have as much standardized data. So certainly interpret the results appropriately, and don't lean too heavily on models or on the technical outputs, even though that's obviously what we presented today. So.
Great, thank you. Well, I would like to start asking some user questions. I think I'd like to start with a few of the questions for Brianna around your work on the Southwest Corridor station access planning. First, could you share the suitability matrix again and give an example of how it was applied?
Yes, let me share my screen. I'm sorry, the picture that I have in the here is not very easy to read, but I can pull up another version too. So how this was applied, so when we were we kind of got to this point, then we were looking at the actual station areas and the actual right-of-way that TriMet has available or potentially has available at those locations. And so they were then taking these and wrapping them into their actual conceptual designs for each of the station areas, and thinking about if they need to shift their concept designs and where they could potentially find space for some of these different elements. It also, I think, helped to further discussion with partner agencies. For example, do they put bike share parking facility on the station platform, or does that go on the public sidewalk, directly adjacent, which would then be in the city of Portland's right-of-way or the city of Tigard's right-of-way? And so having those conversations, they could start with this and say, hey, we think that we should, put these elements into this, but we don't have the space. So how can we partner to put all of these into the area and bring people into the station areas? And so it kind of came into play in both of those those ways.
Thank you. And then one additional question on the Southwest Corridor work. How was the decision, how did the analysis that you did inform decisions around whether to place parking structures at stations and how much parking to locate?
That was actually not a part of the work that we did. So TriMet had other work done and had looked into the siting of parking structures. And so we started with assumptions on where those would be and just looked at then flexibility in those spaces. So maybe in the future, some of those parking spaces could be shifted to electric vehicle charging. Could spaces be in the future taken up for bike corrals or bike docking stations, things like that? But the actual siting of those parking garages was not part of the work that we did.
Okay, great. That's really helpful to know. We've got one question from Jacob Armstrong that has gotten a lot of upvotes, so I'd like to bring that up. Jacob asked, he says it's briefly mentioned that the people making decisions don't necessarily reflect the communities that utilize transit, and that's an issue in the field of planning in general. Certainly, if you look at the complexion of everyone presenting today, it's an issue, here as well. So can you speak on efforts to hire and give voice to people that reflect the communities we're trying to prioritize? I'm happy to talk about that from the private sector point of view, but I know Metro has done a lot around this question. And so Caleb, if you'd like to jump in, I'd love to hear what you have to say from that perspective.
Great. Yeah, specifically what we touched on that was in the equity tree, kind of working through who is being included in decision making, and highlighting that, we have TISMO leadership, and we also have our TISMO workforce, and, it's some of the capabilities that behind TISMO is who has training, are we constantly, but we ask in between all that, do they reflect the diversity and values of the region? I'm the only planner for Metro with TISMO, but I think what I can describe some of the efforts we made through this update that that helped, and some of the background. So we had our DEI strategy, we did our RTP update. We also had a ballot measure, and there was a lot of Metro community listening through that. We took some of that. We also took this equity tree and asked for resources from some of our community-based organizations, the Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon. We had Verde, and we also had Division Midway Alliance on our stakeholders. And the Metro practice has been to offer the nonprofit a contribution based on that input. So that's what I ran into when asking more community-based organizations to offer help. Is, again, TISMO, I should say, it is a little difficult to break in and have community interest in something that's pretty invisible, pretty technical, and it takes a little bit to see. I think we've done a good job through the TISMO strategy to see how it relates to the rest of the transportation system. But so I did get turned down. People are very busy. These organizations are very busy, and they thought, if you really want to work with us, let's have a task. Let's have some kind of agreement or contract. And I thought that was a good takeaway, that we need to plan that kind of input into next projects. So yeah, we've had some review, and that has definitely helped shape this. Yeah, we operate a monthly meeting transport that has a gathering of a lot of engineers and planners from around the region, and we don't have a say in who they hire or who they appoint, but we recognize in our bylaws that it's about people, power, place, forgetting what process, that we that we operate that committee of Metro in that way. So yeah, I hope we evolve.
Yeah. Thank you, Caleb. And just to speak a little bit to the private sector viewpoint, and this is I can speak for Fair and Peers. I can't speak for all private sector employers, but we certainly have recognized that the traditional workforce, which tends to be people white folks are overrepresented. Historically, men have been overrepresented. Gender minorities have been underrepresented, and of course, people from middle class, upper middle class backgrounds have also been overrepresented. So there's a lot of ways in which the private sector has not had the level of employment from traditionally underrepresented groups that we'd like to see. Our goal is to really make sure that the demographics of our offices represent the communities that we serve. We've been working on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues internally since around 2019. Chris, you might know from even earlier, it might be 2018. And currently we have of course, like a lot of firms last year, went through a lot of soul searching, worked with an outside consultant to really get the pulse of people working here and identify what the specific challenges are. Right now we have a DEI council, which is a working group focusing on 4 different areas. The first is entry-level hiring and recruiting, finding ways to diversify people who are coming in at the start of their careers, mid and senior level recruiting, to start to address some of those gaps that we are already baked into the leadership structure. If you're, overrepresenting certain groups in the initial stages, then that's going to continue all the way up, and so you have to intervene at the mid and senior levels. The next area is looking at promotion. So are people getting the support and the recognition and the promotions that we want to see? And then finally, looking at training to support a cultural shift around all those issues. So with that, I'd like to actually turn to Christine Wolf's questions. Christine, you mentioned first thinking about TISMO, wondering how the effort addresses the need to support the folks who work in transportation and are dependent on transportation for their jobs. So coming from a perspective of ports and freight mobility. And then you had a follow-up question, Christine, that you're concerned about unintended consequences on living wage jobs due to unintended negative impacts on freight mobility, and you're hoping that will be taken into consideration. So with a focus on freight and the need for the transportation sector to have adequate access and mobility, Caleb and Chris, do you have any thoughts on that?
I'd love to jump in, Caleb, if you don't mind. I think that, and Christine, I saw this pop up early on, so I've been giving it some thought. There's a few places within the strategy where this actually showed up, and it's a conversation that the stakeholder group had several times over the course of the project. So I think there's a few different folks here. So there's the transportation, there's the folks who depend on transportation for their work, and it's probably us on our call, but then there's also the people who are using transportation and operating, like the mobility on demand operators and the freight drivers and the people who work at the port, and there's a large variety of people who depend on transportation for work, as well as people who depend on transportation to get to their work, right? So it's a pretty wide-ranging question. One of the goals that we identified pretty early on were partnerships and collaboration, and that included specifically working with different jurisdictions, including freight and transit, to understand how operators work. One of the major concerns we had raised early on in our stakeholder group was transit operator security, because we did hear through that the transit operators have a history of being harassed or physically abused during their work, and that's just not an acceptable outcome that we want. So making sure that we would look at something to be able to help and keep that in our mind. So some of those collaborations and partnerships, just to be able to talk to folks. As far as the freight goes, we have ITS and freight groups, and we're also working on a work plan right now. And this is actually I think the direction we're going is having multiple work plans, but there's a group in the metro area called Transport, which focuses on ITS, and they have several working committees. And the working committees are getting these work plans to be able to understand how they should work through each of these actions and what the steps are going to be over the next 3 years to making sure that we're on progress for all the early identified actions in the plan. And those working groups, we are hoping to not just include the ITS professionals, but we're hoping to bring in the freight professionals, community-based organizations and operators, so that it's the whole gamut, because TSMO doesn't just end at planning, right? It's installing, and then of course, to get to the question that you just said, how do we avoid the unintended consequences? The very first step of avoiding them is understanding when they happen. So we're hoping that the performance metrics that we have will identify if we're moving in the right direction. And if we're not, we need to go through and change our action plan. So the idea of the strategy isn't that these actions are now set in stone. We're not coming off the mountain with tablets to say this is how transportation needs to be. We are saying this is what we want it to be, and this is how we think we're going to get there. But if that's not going to get us there, then we need to change direction. And it's built into the equity tree. It's built into the plan just by giving us those metrics to track, as well as identifying key metrics so that we know, our exploratory metrics, so that we know we may not be able to measure it the way we want to today.
I'd like to add just a couple notes, in asking that question, whose congestion, it matters also to freight travel, whose jobs, they have consequences for being late. They have electronic logging devices, meaning they have to pull over, and they end up parking in unsafe areas. And that's in response sometimes to the unpredictable congestion. So we kind of have to be a partner to freight to see where are there safe places to park. And the Oregon DOT has really worked on that, but it's something we'll pick up. I know Clackamas County, part of our region, has been leading on that as well. And then, airport, I think Chris briefly mentioned that. This, we have a late night bus that serves the port in addition to light rail. So when the light rail is not running, this late night bus, makes it a 24-hour service. So recognizing access. So what else can we support through our TSMO efforts around mobility on demand or other ways of getting there? And then, we still have our intelligent transportation systems and looking at freight signal priority and how do we upgrade, both, and that's a safety outcome. And so we can look at our safety map and also the equity focus areas to make, those first investments.
Great, thank you both. So one question from Jennifer Nauer, any examples of existing strategic frameworks that advance equity outcomes within historically underserved communities through asset management processes and decision making? So, models that are used to integrate asset data with community identified needs and socio-demographic data. I can point you to one, which is the City of Oakland, California's equitable paving plan, which came out, I think, just a few years ago, and is a great example, but I want to hand it over to our speakers as well. So again, looking at equity when it comes to asset management processes and decision making.
That we have, we've been asked about asset management, and it's interesting one for TSMO, and I think where we ran into it recently was about that goal of being around resiliency and being agile to change, and thinking about what breaks down that we're trying to manage as a system. When does the data communications get interrupted and put a lot of information services out? So that I think from a regional perspective, that's what we Metro want to get most involved in, is how to support an ongoing service and making it resilient, because at the local level, there's a lot more asset management concerns, and it's part of a bigger budget, a lot bigger budget than what we have at the regional level.
Thank you.
So I would just say, we've tried to include some of that in this strategy. I'm struggling to come up with some existing strategies that are, 5-10 years old now that have been super successful in seeing all this change. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I think that just points to the fact that, we should do better in our advancing equity outcomes. And I think as a profession, we're still struggling to show that we can make a change that is meaningful.
Yeah. Thank you both. Okay, there's a few more questions that I noted that we definitely want to get to. Cecilia Martinez Vasquez asked, what strategies for collecting data are you using to inform your work, given that historically marginalized people are moving farther out of the metro areas? Any comments on that?
I feel like Brianna will have some good thoughts on this one too, because I know that you've helped us understand the data that's available, but I wanted to add that we nod to that same sort of lack of data supply in our Metro TISMO strategy, and hoped to say that there would be a lot, more investigations onto new data information to be able to track that more.
Yeah, so there's certainly some of the publicly available, data such as census data and the jobs data from LEHD, which Aaron just put a link into the chat if you want to dig into that a little bit. But we are finding that a lot of times there are barriers because each agency and each department kind of has their own information. And so trying to, as part of the TISMO strategy, we're talking about trying to pull all that information together. So do I just have signal data over in this one city, and do I just have pavement condition over in this other city, and where are there gaps in that data that we can help to fill and help to cross those barriers so that it's all available and we can look at the system holistically. But then thinking about equity and demographic data and understanding where people are coming from, there's a lot of new big data sources that we're able to look at. There's still ones that need to be explored because there can certainly be a bias in that data. A lot of them are based on cell phone GPS data, and suddenly then you automatically have a bias towards people who own cell phones, of course. And so really digging into those, figuring out where they're getting the data from, is it representative, or if not, where are the biases? And how can we still use this data to give us a fuller picture while being conscious of the flaws in any data source that you're going to find. So I think there's some traditional data and more data collection that could be done, as well as those newer sources that we're still all digging into.
Yeah, and I'll bring up a different example. I was working with Seattle DOT on electric vehicle siting. And I guess this is kind of the reverse of what you referenced, Cecilia, of trying to identify where people are moving to as they're displaced. This was using a displacement risk layer to help inform the siting of potential electric vehicle charging infrastructure, recognizing the potential effect that something like that may have if not conducted with other investments in the community to help mitigate potential displacement risk. So yeah, there's kind of the reverse of looking at trying to forecast out where our lower income communities in particular potentially being pushed out from metro areas, but also just looking at those particular areas of displacement risk and using that to inform your equity analysis.
And I would also add that there's a lot of sources for volumes of data, but that can't replace also the public outreach and actually having those conversations with the community. And it's not maybe going to give you as many hard numbers to work with, but if you're not getting those community conversations and community voices, then you're missing part of that data too. So it's certainly a key piece to go along with the numbers and the volumes that you can find.
And that's a great comment, Brianna. In our equity tree, it starts with what data is needed to measure a TISMO solution's impact on equity, and are all sides of the table involved in defining data needs. And that was really important to, one of the community-based organization contacts we worked with, that that we think about who's at that table deciding what data goes in and what's missing, because we had everything about data gaps and looking at disaggregate data, but we didn't think about, that's the place. Data is on its way to a scenario to be applied to some kind of project or solution.
Great. Well, I think we've got all the questions addressed in the chat, but I do have a few follow-up questions, and please keep popping in questions. We have a few more minutes here as they come up, and let me know in the chat if I missed your question. But I'd like to understand, we've talked a little bit about who some of those key stakeholders are on equity planning efforts, particularly with respect to the TISMO work that you're doing. Are there any other key stakeholders that you've had the opportunity to engage with on equity planning efforts, and what do you find to be the best ways to coordinate with them for anyone on the panel?
I want to give a hats off to Caleb here, because he really was instrumental in getting our stakeholder group set up. And not only did he look for technical champions from different agencies, but he made sure that the demographics of our stakeholder group were also as varied as the communities they serve. So we ended up with a group that was pretty unique, I think, for this project. And we ended up hearing a lot of things that we wouldn't normally hear. We also went to some focus groups specifically on equity, and brought in some individuals who had shown interest during like a survey, as well as individuals that we knew we wanted to reach out to. And then Caleb, I know that you went to specific community-based organizations and were able to compensate them. And I know that's something that some agencies struggle for. So that might be a good topic here.
Yeah, I think that's a good practice, and I think it ultimately that helped by I have now a relationship with those people I talked with and worked through and heard their input and applied it to the equity tree, and that was pointed out back to me, like now we're talking about what projects are important. They pointed out that this Division Transit project is going to serve Gresham to downtown Portland. It's a great connector. It offers, I can see how it offers this great added capacity and reliability to the transit system in our region. But what about the travel from, for residents to, where there are living wage jobs in the Columbia corridor? So that was something, that was important, pointed out. So anyway, it's just, it is about forming relationships and knowing what our program can accomplish and what is needed. And then Chris, I'm glad you brought up the Stakeholder Advisory Committee, because we made a conscious effort, and we always would, to be at this manager director level. But we did bring in community leaders, we did bring in university research leaders, that helps to have a high level and a sort of decision, decision body behind us, because we are working with a lot of different experts, in technology and engineering, but if we're also getting, we heard a lot and put a lot into our equity parts of our TISMO strategy from the Stakeholder Advisory Committee, and just having them lead on that. I guess that's my point. Just having the leaders demonstrate their leadership. We could put that into the TISMO strategy, and then that's going to help us implement, because we got to run with this 10 years. So we need everybody behind us.
Great. I do want to ask one more question that Sherman Gong has just brought up, a very interesting one. Where smaller cities are trying to incorporate equity elements, often demographic areas aren't so easily identified. So if you have a smaller city, the census data is going to be more highly aggregated to protect the anonymity of respondents, right? So how would you suggest working with that limitation?
I would start, first you still have to ask the who's traveling where question, right? So I think that I understand that the census data is not going to be as helpful in that. But I do think that you can still understand what is the demographics of your community. And then, through travel surveys and other data collection, you probably have some idea of how people are traveling. So again, looking back at the metro work, there's definitely areas that we can say, BIPOC communities, 25% of them have no car and rely on transit, right? So that helps us identify, well, we know where the transit routes are. How can we focus on improving that mode? We talk a lot about bike lanes and, pedestrian connectivity, and understanding how bike lanes impact BIPOC communities and whether or not that's an appropriate improvement that would be used is something, again, that you kind of need to ask yourself when going through these. So very much understanding the type of treatment that is going to work for different communities, and then of course making sure you're talking to those communities so they understand and are able to, because I know especially around the Washington area, a lot of those communities in the smaller cities aren't going to speak English. So if you're not providing outreach in their language in a format that makes sense to them, they're not gonna offer the information, right?
I would add, regardless of what demographics you have, if there's a safety issue, you know it's going to disproportionately affect people. So that's an important one to prioritize. Take a safe systems approach, give leading pedestrian intervals, or find the solution, look at safer transit. And we're also, our Washington County partners are innovating with uses of radar for detection and cameras for near miss, so try to get out ahead of safety issues might be one way to think about it. And yeah, just the residential demographics are limited. There's people travel, and we heard earlier, the people who are displaced are traveling farther. So yeah, we need to think about the whole trip, and is that a trip to an opportunity such as a job or medical need or recreation or what, so there's still, I think, a lot of different ways to build in equity into a small city.
Great.
And
Thank you. Go ahead, Aaron.
Well,
sorry.
yeah, and I'll just kind of add in similar theme, but yeah, less of the focus becomes, just purely from the travel access perspective, less of the focus is on that origin demographic profile and more about recognizing those patterns. And I think Chris and Caleb mentioned, how you leverage travel survey data or other needs to recognize the higher importance of midday travel, evening travel, for example. And then really leveraging a more robust destination data set if possible, and less of a focus on the breakdown of those origins and the geographic differences within your city when it's a smaller city, and really focused on the when and the to what elements of travel access is more important in that case.
Great, thank you. We have 5 minutes left, and I do want to ask one final question. Really thinking about, the planning efforts are important, but what really matters is when those efforts get implemented. So my final question is, what are some methods that you've used to ensure accountability in the implementation of TSMO and some of these other equity planning efforts? And for those of us in the private sector, maybe what have you seen done to do that? Because we tend to step away when it comes to implementation.
I can say for the TSMO project that we just did, the performance metrics are explicitly looking to measure how we've made progress on transportation equity in the region, and then report that back so we can track it and identifying new ways of measuring it that we'd like, that we just don't have the capabilities of doing today. I can speak to some of the work that we've done in California on sort of the transit happiness metric as well. Not super familiar with it, but I'm sure we can find additional information. That's been something that I think, helping to measure, how comfortable people are using different modes, that has been a good tool to have in the box as well.
Yeah, I think we've been through project solicitation where we're getting, you know, cities, counties applying for a TISMO program funded project. And, you know, we're able to, when it's using the equity focus areas on the map, we're able to point out and where we're going to invest. And, you know, that's helped to a degree, and there have been shifts in those projects. And so we can come back to the reminder, well, we were using, you know, this criteria to approve your project. We can't have you shift your project elsewhere. You know, like that's, we got to go back and you know, you're implementing our regional policy. So there's been some of that, but I really like what Chris, Brianna, and others have set up for us, and where we're going with the work plan, and having really stressing that we have leadership on each of the actions, and that we're coming back and reporting progress quarterly, so that you know, that's where we're gonna, you know, we're gonna be accountable to that table at transport, and to each other through that.
And I think to add on to that a little bit, also part of the TISMO planning was setting up pipelines for the community to more easily provide feedback, and making sure that we're removing barriers for communities to give feedback, so that we hopefully will be able to then hear back and say, yeah, this sounds good on paper, and you know, this looks really great, but my lived experience of this project or of what you're planning is going to be different. And making sure that we hear those voices, and set up for the future so that it's easier and easier to get that feedback from the community.
Great. Well, thank you so much for these responses. I'd just like to thank everyone who's attended today's webinar, and especially those who asked questions. We really appreciate your engagement on that, and pushing us to think a little bit more, and share a little bit more information about this. I'd also like to thank our presenters, Caleb from Oregon Metro, Chris, Brianna, and Aaron from Fair and Peers. And I'd also like to give a special thanks to Michael Adamson, who coordinated this entire thing and has been running everything behind the scenes. All right, so thank you all so much. And I believe the slides and a recording will be available later this week. So keep your eyes on your email inboxes. You should be getting some more information soon. Thanks again, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.